The boat was already burning when Jan Baalsrud hit the water. German fire was chewing into the fishing vessel Bratholm off the coast of northern Norway on March 29, 1943, and the sabotage mission that had slipped out of the Shetlands under cover of war had collapsed in minutes. Men shouted over the engine noise, over the gunfire, over the blast as the explosives aboard were set to destroy the boat before the Germans could take it. Then there was only the cold. Baalsrud went into Arctic water wearing heavy clothing, one sea boot soon gone. The shoreline still separated from him by black freezing waves. Behind him, his comrades were being killed, captured, or driven under. Ahead of him was occupied Norway. Snow, mountains, patrols, and a chase that should have ended with his body found somewhere on the rocks. He had not come to Norway alone. Baalsrud was a Norwegian commando with Company Linge, part of a 12-man team sent in Operation Martin to northern Norway to organize resistance work and strike German targets, including the airfield control tower at Bardufoss. The mission had been planned in Britain and launched from the Shetlands, but almost as soon as the party reached the Troms area, it began to go wrong. A contact attempt misfired when a local man, frightened and suspicious, reported them. The Germans moved fast. When Bratholm was attacked off Rebbenesoya, Baalsrud became the only man from the operation who managed to evade capture. The others were either shot in the immediate fighting or later arrested, interrogated, tortured, and executed. He knew none of the larger outcome yet. What he knew in those first moments was narrower and more urgent. He had to get ashore and keep moving. He made land in soaked clothes and near immediate danger. During the escape from the waterline, he encountered a German pursuing him at close range and shot him with his pistol before pushing farther inland. He had almost nothing that would help a man survive in winter mountains for long. He was wet. He was already freezing. He was missing a boot. He had to keep ahead of the search that spread outward behind him while he crossed ground. He could barely manage in his condition. The cold started taking pieces of him almost at once. His feet were the first to go. Then his sight began to suffer in the glare of snow and weather. Still, he kept climbing, moving through ravines and overexposed ground toward the interior, because stopping in that state meant death every bit as surely as capture. The escape turned into a relay of human mercy across northern Norway. Local Norwegians found him, hid him, fed him, and then passed him on. Each person who helped him risked arrest, torture, or execution if the Germans found out. Farmers, fishermen, villagers, and resistance supporters moved him through a country that was white with late winter snow and full of danger. Sometimes they got him into a barn or hut. Sometimes they had to leave him hidden under open sky or in crude shelter while patrols passed. At one point, he became trapped in a snowstorm and wandered for days. At another, he was caught by an avalanche and buried up to his neck, pinned in the cold until he could be dug free. The suffering never came as one clean test. It kept changing shape. When the Germans searched one district, his helpers shifted him to another. When weather blocked movement, they left him in place and prayed he could last until they returned. His body was failing while the escape kept lengthening. Frostbite blackened his feet. Snow blindness damaged his vision. Hunger and dehydration wore him down. He spent periods almost unable to move except with assistance. And yet there were stretches when he was left entirely alone, because the people helping him had no safe choice. One of the most famous of those places was the hut he later called Hotel Savoy, a crude shelter in Revdalen where he waited while hidden from German searchers. There, with his feet rotting and the threat of gangrene climbing upward, Baalsrud took a pocket knife and began cutting away his own dead flesh. He amputated his big toe and part of another to try to save what remained. It was the kind of act that sounds impossible until the alternative is clearer than the pain. He was not trying to be brave. He was trying not to lose both feet and not to die before the next help arrived. The German hunt kept pressing behind the whole ordeal. Baalsrud was no longer just a fugitive moving on his own strength. In many stages he had to be transported. Villagers hid him in sheds, barns, and outbuildings. At times he was lashed onto a stretcher and dragged or carried through deep snow over routes that healthy men found exhausting. Men who knew the mountains judged weather, patrol patterns, and terrain before deciding when he could be moved and when he had to stay hidden. In the Mandalin area, he spent weeks in worsening condition while people built protective snow walls around a rock shelter and tried to keep him alive. He later lost a total of 9 toes to frostbite, but those losses came because he survived long enough for the damage to declare itself. Many men in the same condition would have died much earlier, either from exposure or infection. Baalsrud stayed alive because others refused to abandon him, and because he refused to give his body over completely, even when he could no longer stand on his own feet. The final stage took him out of Norway by way of people who understood winter movement better than the Germans chasing him. Sami helpers pulled him on a sled during their spring migration route across the north, moving him toward Finland and then Sweden. By then, he had been on the run for roughly 9 weeks. The man who had gone into the water after Brattholm was gone. In his place was a half-blind, frost-bitten wreck wrapped and hauled across snow by people who knew that if they made a mistake, the Germans would not treat any of them gently. On June 1st, 1943, Baalsrud finally reached Sweden. He was then flown onward for treatment in Boden, where doctors took the rest of the toes that could not be saved. The escape had lasted about 63 days. What made the story so brutal was not just the length of it or the cold, though both were extreme. It was the way survival had to be earned over and over again. He survived the sabotage mission blowing apart under German fire. He survived the swim through freezing water. He survived being hunted across snowbound country by occupation forces. He survived avalanche burial, storm exposure, hunger, snow blindness, and the slow destruction of his feet. He survived the stretches of isolation when the people helping him could not safely return on schedule, and he had to lie still and trust that someone was still coming. At every stage, there had been a point where the easier ending was death. Each time, somehow, the chain held. Baalsrud eventually recovered in Sweden, went back into service, and lived until 1988, but the part that fixed his name in history happened in those 2 months in 1943, when his world narrowed to cold, pursuit, and the next safe hiding place. His escape became famous not because it was neat or cinematic, but because it was so physically ugly and so dependent on endurance after endurance. He did not simply outrun the Germans, he outlasted conditions that should have ended him long before the border. That is why Jan Baalsrud remains one of the most brutal cold-weather survival cases of the Second World War. He crawled, hid, bled, froze, cut pieces off himself, and kept going until other hands could drag him the rest of the way. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.